Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to tell you about how I use QGIS in my work at UC Davis Data Lab. So my my talk today is titled QGIS, a tool for collaboration and research at universities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I prefer QGIS in a lot of cases for folks when I'm making recommendations, but also show you a couple examples of some of the things that we're doing that actually require QGIS for the workflow we're doing. So sort of my thesis, what I want to prove to you today, or give you some good reasons for it, is the statement. So QGIS is often the best desktop GIS for academics invested in reproducible research, collaboration, and education. So it's not always the best choice, but in many cases it is. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I'm a big proponent of use the tool that works, and oftentimes it's QGIS. It could be other things too, though. Oh, yay, slide animations. I couldn't get that to turn off. Why is this statement true? And you seeing pictures of our map room because maps are cool. So why is this tool important? Why is this good? So one of the things I mentioned was reproducibility. In academia, the concept of reproducibility is important. It's the idea that if I do some research and I publish a paper and say, this is the method I used, this is the data I used to do this analysis, you should be able to take that set of methods and that input data and come up with the same thing. You should be able to reproduce the results. The nice thing about tools like QGIS and other open source tools is that the code, the underlying code, is available. It's open box. We say so. The idea is because it's open source and we can see the code if we want to, we can see what the programming is under the hood. We know what the algorithms are doing. It's not a surprise. And if things are not coming out the same every time, we can look at the code and find out why. Like maybe it's starting with a different seed, or there's a random process in there, but we'll know why it's not the same. Or we can choose to use something that it fits our needs better. And also scripting is an option. QGIS is traditionally thought of as a desktop GIS with point and click options. You fill in forms and things like that, but you can actually script with it. So if you need to make a workflow that works automatically that you want to run with a script, you can do that. And that's really nice. Not only can you do that within QGIS, but you can actually hook into QGIS's processes with other tools. So for example, I'm actually working on a project right now where we're using R to do the programming, but there are tools that let us access QGIS through R. And so I'm actually using some of the geospatial processing tools like union and clipping, those kinds of things from R, but we're scripting it. So it can all be reproduced. I can run that script with the same input data and get the same output every time and not have errors or different outputs. So it's reproducible. In terms of collaboration, I think over the course of my career, collaborating with others has become so much more important. And I think we're kind of heading in that direction more and more, where we need to work with other people to produce new and better research. So the nice thing about QGIS is that it's available on all operating systems. So when I work with folks who have a Mac, I can just be like, hey, you can use this. You don't need to do anything special. You just download it, install it like any other program, and it's available. The other thing I like is you can work with other folks who have, for example, like at nonprofits where they might have a small budget, because QGIS is free. They don't have to worry about that breaking the bank. So that makes it really nice and easy to collaborate, because I can be like, it doesn't matter what your budget is, you can afford this. And so we can all work with the same tools. It also allows access to GIS in industries that maybe haven't had access before or didn't know they need spatial analysis. I had a situation in a previous place that I worked where, I didn't have to ask permission because it was free. So I could just download it and install it. and use it. And that was nice. And also in terms of collaboration, the community for QGIS is amazing, and just open source GIS in general. There are a lot of folks out there who are willing to help, who are willing to collaborate. You just need to reach out and make some connections, and the community is really supportive. In terms of education, I really like QGIS because you can further your skills outside of your employer, outside of your employment or your school enrollment status. So I actually, for the job that I'm currently in, got asked if I had skills with a very particular suite of software and a particular extension. And my answer was, no, I actually don't have experience with that because I've never been in an employment situation where we've had access to that particular piece of software. And I thought, I'm not going to get this job because I didn't have that opportunity before. Like, I've never worked in that position. So it's like a chicken and egg situation. You can't get the job because you've never had a job being able to do that thing. But my answer was that I followed up with it, I haven't done that with that tool. However, in the open source world, I have done similar things. And because I've done similar things, I'm confident that I can learn that. And that actually ended up being a good answer, I guess, because I got the job. But you don't need to worry about, like, do you have access to a license? Do I have to pay for the software to learn? You don't. You can just use it. You can, if you need to develop a certain skill or skill set, you have access to the software to be able to do that. Also, you can use QGIS after you graduate, after you retire, after you get a new job. It's still there for you. You don't have to worry about, am I going to lose access? You won't. It's there. So I recommend that a lot, especially to folks who are graduating and saying, now what do I do? I'm not going to have access to my software. And I'm like, hey, you know what? Go open source and you'll be fine. And then also there's tons of learning resources. This kind of goes hand in hand with the community comment that there are a lot of folks out there making tutorials and workshops and things like that. I know I do some workshops with QGIS because, at UC Davis, we've got folks who are interested in learning it. So check out my GitHub account and you'll find some good resources there that we use quite a bit in DataLab. And then some just practical reasons. Cost, it's free, can't beat that. You don't have to deal with license issues. So if you're going out in the field and you're not going to have internet access, you don't have to worry about figuring out how to deal with the license that needs to connect to the internet. You also have a really nice release schedule with QGIS. There are really frequent updates. And responsive developers. I'll tell you a little story before I get into the details of the project I want to tell you about, and just say that for the AVA project I'm going to tell you about in a minute here, when we first were getting started, like in the first year, QGIS changed how it was handling GeoJSON files, and what was happening was when there was a column that had no data in it, the column wasn't appearing in the attribute table because the thought was, well, there's nothing in it. Why do you need to see it? And when that happened, it made my project not work anymore, because what we were doing was we had a blank attribute table and people were digitizing and filling in the attribute table. So we had kind of a template that people were filling in. And so when basically our attribute table disappeared with they made this change. And so I was able to file a bug and explain what was going on and why we needed to have blank columns. And the response was, we didn't think about that, let's fix it. And within 2 days we had it fixed. So that's not always the case that they can fix things that quickly, but it was super nice that it was able to get fixed. And then we were able to move forward with the project, because I was thinking like, oh no, we're dead in the water now. But because the developers were able to take that on and fix it, we were able to get moving and get that. I think it was a better for the whole community to have that option fixed. So yeah, really good community, folks working on all aspects of the project. So I want to tell you about a project that I think illustrates some of the concepts I was just talking about really well. So this is the AVA Boundary Digitizing Project. And it's a project that's been going on in the UC Davis Library since 2017, so about 5.5 years. And it's an ongoing project, and we use QGIS at the heart of this, and I think it's a really good example of research collaboration and collaborative data creation. So, okay, I've said the phrase AVA a couple times. Now I'm going to tell you what it means. So AVA stands for American Viticultural Area, and these are wine growing regions in the United States. The idea is that it's a boundary that encloses an area that produces unique wine because of the unique growing conditions within that boundary. And the AVA designations, these boundaries are used in particular for marketing to explain, that this particular wine was produced in a special place and has a particular characteristic. The definitions for the AVAs, so the actual boundary descriptions, are maintained by the U.S. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. That is abbreviated TTB, which is good because that whole name is hard to say. And the boundaries are actually recorded as narrative text. So these boundaries, it's not uncommon to have a boundary that says, the starting point is at the intersection of Maple Road and First Street. Follow Maple Road until it hits the 250-foot topo line. And so it goes on like that. These are not spatial in any way except for the description on that references a map. So you can't just throw this in your QGIS project and go. These need to be translated into spatial data. And the way that the AVA process works is that someone petitions the US federal government to make this AVA. They fill out this petition form and create a description. Then there's a public comment period where people can voice their support or say, this is not a good idea, we shouldn't have this one, or I like this, but this boundary needs to be changed in this way. That's kind of the typical comments. And then once that public comment period is over, the TTB makes a decision whether they want to actually make this an official AVA or not. And if they decide they want to keep it, then they produce a document called a final rule. And that gets published in basically in federal law. So these are official federal boundaries. However, like I said, they're not that useful in text form when you want to make a map or do any kind of spatial analysis. So we wanted to fix that problem. So I mentioned that these AVA boundaries are for marketing purposes, and you can see these. I grabbed some wine labels from a wine site. And you can see on the labels that they have words like Napa Valley and Santa Maria Valley and Mount Veeder. So these are all official boundaries, official AVAs, and there's a rule that a certain percentage of the wine that goes into these wine bottles, if it's labeled with an AVA name, it has to come from inside that AVA, a certain percentage. So these are not just words that describe a general place, it actually describes a very specific location with a federal legal definition. And these, that's why I put the boundaries there, so you can kind of see that these relate to a place. These are not to scale though. I don't know that Santa Maria Valley is as, you can compare it to the size of the other ones. That one looks particularly large to me. But anyway, so the idea is that these words on the wine labels are actually linked to a specific, very specific location in the world. So our goal with this project was to make an open source data set of American viticultural area boundaries that's suitable for research. So it needs to be something that's well defined. We need to have our methods need to be very well documented, again, so it's repeatable. If somebody else wanted to make the same boundaries, they could use our methods and come up with pretty much the same thing. There's human interpretation going on here, so they're never 100% the same, but we do check them and make sure that they are as close to the description as possible. So the tools we use in this project are all freely available. So we use QGIS, we use R. Mostly R is used for aggregating our files so that we can you don't have to download all 266 of them individually. You can get one file with all of them in it. And then we also use GitHub, and I'll talk a little bit about how we use those together in a little bit. The data that goes into these is typically USGS topo maps, and then the US government documents, in particular the Code of Federal Regulations, where those boundary descriptions are published. And the CFR, the federal regulations document, says which topo maps to use in the boundaries. So we follow that as closely as we can. So how does this get done? I like to say this happens with teamwork, QGIS, and GitHub. When we started this in 2017, there were 240 boundaries, which was daunting enough, and it was not something that one person could handle. Now, in 2022, I think we just hit 266 because these things get approved and changed and things like that pretty regularly. In fact, the previous administration didn't approve very many of them. There was a whole bunch, just kind of sitting and waiting to be made official. And then when we changed federal administrations, we saw a lot more getting approved. So we've had quite a few in the last year or so that have been added to the list, and we've been trying to keep up with making sure those are digitized. I think we just finished up all of the ones that we had on the list that needed to be made. So each of these boundaries takes about between an hour to 2 weeks. So you can have a really simple one that usually has 1 or 2 maps. You can knock that out in about an hour if you're familiar with the process. And then there's some in California that are enormous and complex. And it took one of my interns about 2 weeks working half-time to finish that. So some of these are pretty complicated and take a lot of time. The nice thing that makes this project actually work really well is the tools we're using are available to everyone and anyone can access them. There's no way this project could happen without that. If people had to have software that wasn't open to everyone, we would not have nearly as much participation. So this project has been a partnership with a lot of people. So this started out with UC Davis, us in the library were like, hey, let's do this. And then we got UCSB, so UC Santa Barbara wanted to join us, and we split up California. UCSB did Southern California, and our folks at Davis, my team, did Northern California, and then started on the rest of the US. At some point in the process, we got someone reaching out from Virginia Tech who wanted to join. And they did a lot of the East Coast AVAs. We kind of met in the middle. And then we've also had about, I think 36 people, his last count, for the number of people who have joined us, because we also have folks joining from the community, including folks I've met on Twitter. So you can, people have joined us from all over the place, and it's been really fun working with all these people and making a really cool product, something that can be crowdsourced. And there's no way you could do this on your own. I actually tried. Before I was in this current position, somebody was like, hey, I need AVA boundaries. And I started on this and did like one and was like, I can't do this. Like, I can't do this alone. It needs this many people. And we'll have more people too. I'm sure at some point I just got a new student intern. So we're always adding people to the list. So this is our process under the hood, how the kind of the collaborative process works. I'm going to start on the right-hand side. This is, if you're a QGIS person, this is probably what you care about more. So the way we make these boundaries is we make template files, like me or some of our interns who are more skilled can make their own template files, but we usually give new folks a template file that's just basically a blank attribute table. It's got like usually we put like a triangle in the middle of the US, so it's kind of a placeholder, but they've got their attribute table all set up so that it will merge with the rest of the data, and we don't make them have to try to make that fit. So it just saves them time. So you get your template file. And then you go get the Federal Register document that belongs to the AVA you want to digitize. And then you read that and it tells you which of the topo maps you need to download from the USGS. So the nice thing is the USGS has already scanned and georeferenced quite a large library of topo maps. So you can get those on a site called TopoView, and they are free and they are already georeferenced. So that saves us a lot of time. So you get your template file, you get your document, and then you get your maps, and then you bring all of that into QGIS, and then you start digitizing the boundary, and you kind of follow that narrative. And it's a little bit like a map scavenger hunt, trying to find the different landmarks that the boundary description lists. And so once you're done with all that and you fill in your attribute table from the Federal Register documents, then you submit it back to the project through the GitHub process. It's called a pull request. I'm not going to get into all the details of what that means, but if you have questions, let me know. I'm happy to go over that offline. And then so basically you submit the pull request, and that goes into a holding area where I will review it and make sure that it looks good, and you know, make sure you hit all the points, and you know, finish your attribute table appropriately. And then if it looks good, we'll approve it, and your data will join the other data in the repository. And it will live on GitHub. So over on the left-hand side of the diagram is how we actually use GitHub. The code tab on GitHub contains, well, now it contains a link to our instructions. We have a new website, a GitHub Pages site that has all of our kind of public-facing information about how we do what we do. It also has our data, and then it auto-generates some maps, which is nice. And then we use the issues tab quite a bit. That is our place where we keep our giant to-do list. So all of the things that need to be done, all those tasks are listed there. And then folks who want to join in can claim a task that they want to work on, and then work on that. That's how we keep track of who's working on what, so we don't end up doing, you know, work on the same thing. We make sure that we're not overwriting each other's efforts. So somebody says, I want to work on this AVA, that's their AVA until they say otherwise. And then our pull request tab is where all of the data that people are offering up end up for us to decide, you know, if it's ready to be merged with the rest of the data set. So all the details in between is like GitHub speak. And like I said, it's not the point of today's talk, but there's some good resources out there for how to learn how to use GitHub if you're not familiar with that. So this is an example of a recent AVA. My new intern's been plugging away at the list of new ones that just came out, and this is one of them in Oregon. It has an exceptionally long name. So normally they're like 2 words, but this one is long and has commas in it. So just to show you sort of what the process kind of looks like, in this particular AVA only requires 2 USGS maps. And so you can see those maps, and you can see sort of the most commonly asked question is, why is there a big white gap in the middle of all of that? And the answer is because that's the map collar on the topo map, and it has a big white boundary around the outside. And they leave that on because it has information in it. Like you can kind of see there's some lat long numbers on the sides of the map around the outside. And there's also a lot of times that's where the township and range information gets printed. So you need that collar because it has the information about what's going on inside the map sometimes. But the maps do overlap because of that. So it's QGIS. You can just turn them on and off to see underneath. But so you can kind of see how this particular AVA, it follows different things like topo lines and roads and various things. And then if you turn off that southern map, you'll see what's underneath it. And there's actually more map underneath that white space in the middle for the map that covers the northern section. And then you can kind of see at the bottom are just a piece of our attribute table, and you can check out our website to see you know, more of what's actually in the attribute table. There's quite a few more columns, but the more important things that I think most people are interested in is we keep information about the names. So what's the official name? And then the AKA column lists other names. Sometimes there'll be sort of alternative names that are official alternatives. And then there may also be situations where an AVA gets renamed. And so we keep the list of affiliated names in that column. That can be helpful for history information. We keep a list of when the AVA was created, and further down, which you can't see, we keep a list of where, like what dates the AVA was valid, because we keep Also, we've digitized all of the historical boundaries. So AVAs can change over time, and you can petition to have an AVA changed. And so we also have all of those revisions digitized too. And we also keep information about, where it is, the county, the state, what AVAs are inside a particular AVA or outside. Like if this AVA is inside a bigger AVA, we have that information. We know who the petitioner was, who's the author of the actual federal document. Some information about, you can see that it has like the CFR index and the CFR revision history. That's information about like where it's published. And then we also keep a list of the approved maps and what maps we use to digitize, because sometimes we can't find the maps that are the official maps. Sometimes the citations aren't specific enough, like they don't tell you what year the map is from, or sometimes we can't, it just hasn't been digitized, or we haven't been able to find that. So we make some substitutions and we keep track of all of that. That's the reproducibility part. So we want to make sure you know what we did and how we did it. This is a screenshot of what we have so far. There are a few missing on here, but you wouldn't be able to tell because they're in California and they're kind of on top of some of the ones that already exist. So this is from a few weeks ago when I did the screenshot, but mostly up to date. So you can kind of get an idea of the distribution of AVAs throughout the country. More than half of them are in California. So that was a heavy lift to get that done originally, but you can kind of see how these are distributed, and also you can kind of see some regional similarities. Like the Midwest tends to have very large AVAs in comparison, and the Pacific Northwest has very complex ones because they are referencing topo lines. So these are in valleys, and that's why you get those kind of squiggly jaggedy edges. Those are typical of following topo lines in that area. But you can see sort of where people are growing wine, and some of that might be surprising, like in the Southwest. So it's kind of cool to see all of that, and it's been fun to watch the map fill in for sure. As people add data, especially when we were just getting started, the map was very blank. It was kind of filling in from the coasts, because we had folks working on the East Coast and the West Coast, and kind of meeting in the middle there. So I'm really proud of this project. It's been really useful. It has been used in publications, and it actually got an award from the University of California Office of the President. So this is the body that manages all of the University of California campuses. So we got an award in 2018 for the collaborative work between UC Davis and UCSB to do California, which was really nice. I think we knew we were doing a good job, but it was really nice to get that recognition. We've also used this in a number of publications. I have some collaborators that I've been working with on a couple of things, but also other folks are using it too. If you are going to be at Phosphor-G, which is already next week, I will be talking about a paper that will be appearing in the conference proceedings about classifying AVAs with different environmental characteristics. So keep your eye out for that, or watch the recording later. That was an interesting paper to put together. But so you can see this is useful for research, as well as just making maps. So one of the other things I want to tell you about is the UC Davis Air Photo Footprint Project. This project uses the exact same framework as the AVA project. And the goal of this project is it's very similar. So we want to digitize the footprints of our air photo collection. Instead of doing boundaries of wine areas, we are looking at individual air photos and digitizing the corners of the air photos. So these are squares or rectangles. So we can see where they live in the real world. And the goal was to help our patrons know where our air photos are located. So if they're, for example, doing research on the Sacramento River or Puda Creek, for example, I think the picture you're looking at here is I think that's the Sacramento River. I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I took this photo, pre-pandemic. But anyway, so the idea is to, instead of having to do this scene, laying it out on the table in the map room, we can put that onto a map, and someone can look at that map and say, oh, okay, that's the, the air photo I need, or I need this, set of them, or maybe I need to get all of them, but they can have an idea of where these air photos are located. And so the GitHub repo looks pretty similar. The process is really similar. All of the way that we use GitHub and set up the collaboration tools there is exactly the same. So we're able to basically take the same framework and plunk it into another project and go, which was nice because it meant that we didn't have to start from scratch. We could kind of start with a project that we already knew worked. This project, however, has been on hold since the pandemic. Obviously for a couple of years, we weren't really able to work in the map room. And so this is something I'm hoping to get started back up with soon. But here's an example of one of the sets of photos up in the Humboldt area. So this is north of San Francisco quite a ways. And you can kind of see the purple squares are where we have air photos. So if you were doing research in this particular area, you would be able to know, like, where does this photo set cover? And, you'd be able to click on individual squares and find out what the photo information is. So you can ask for someone to help you find that in our big files of air photos, which is a heck of a lot better than pulling out the folder for the air photos and having to leaf through all of them and being like, is that what I need? Where is that? Like, right away that these are the cells you need, and you need to pull those and scan them. So that's the idea with this particular project. And at some point I do want to get back to this now that we can actually be in the physical space and we know how to do that safely again. So something on the horizon. Also, it's just fun to look at air photos. So it's another bonus of that particular project. So in terms of the AVAs and also a little bit about the air photos, hopefully I've shown to you that QGIS is useful in terms of reproducibility, collaboration, and education. So in terms of reproducibility, the AVA project has very clear documented methods. We tell you exactly how we're doing things and what our process is, and we keep track of questions and things like that, so you have an idea of where this data came from and how it got made. The tools and input data for all of the project is available to anyone. Everything we're working with is freely available. And the framework for this has been able to be used for other projects like the Air Photo project and used fairly smoothly. In terms of collaboration, this project has attracted many collaborators, and we've had contributors from all over the place, including there's one person who has contributed data to this project who has a GitHub handle that does not indicate their name. So I do not know this person's name, but they've contributed several polygons to us. And it's always odd talking about someone by their GitHub handle. So, but it's cool. It's fine. We're happy to have the contributions, but it's just interesting that this is a person I've never met, but they've made a wonderful contribution to this project. And also in terms of education, the project itself has been really a nice place for students to learn, and also other folks. I've had people, like I mentioned, I met somebody on Twitter through GIS chat who joined the project to learn new skills, in particular to get better at mapping skills and to learn QGIS. And he was looking for those skills and was like, does anyone have a project I can work on? And I was like, hey, why don't you take a look at the AVA project and see if that looks good? And he ended up contributing several polygons and being able to shift his career to a career in geo. So that's like one of my big, like, we're doing this for the greater good, and this thing serves a purpose beyond just making, research data. People actually have used this to learn important skills. So people, when they contribute to this project, learn things like specifically QGIS, but they also learn things like how to manage files with GitHub, how to read topo maps, how to digitize, and data management's a big project in itself with this project because we just have so much data to keep track of. So people learn a lot of things when they join us and contribute to the project. So I've been through a lot of things very quickly. I think we've got plenty of time for questions. So I'm not sure how Cliff, you want to handle questions, but
yeah, I have a bunch of questions come in. Everybody, you can send your questions to the chat. Send your questions to either the Q&A window or just to the chat. I'm fine. I have a bunch.
Okay.
Some were sent to me privately. First one, back to the reproducible aspect of working with QGIS.
Yeah.
Do you ever have problems when QGIS upgraded to version 3? Do you ever have any problems where something was created for version 2? And now that you're in version 3, if you try to reproduce something, it doesn't work, then tool is different. Ever have any issues there?
I haven't. I could see how that might happen, like with like the plugins had to get rewritten and things like that, where things might function differently. I haven't run into that myself, but you know, that all the data you're producing should work regardless, but you know, workflows might not continue to work. I think we're getting far enough away from that transition, though, that I think it's probably less of a problem for people, and you know, just sort of a legacy issue. But I mean, that was a huge transition. I had to rewrite my own plugin, so
yeah, and that's what I figured. So I figured now, if we are trying to be reproducible with our data, you know, definitely note versions.
Yeah.
Of everything you're using.
Yeah.
Sort of goes without saying, but sometimes it's worth saying or reminding.
Yeah, it's important to, I'll just plug, you should cite your software. I'm a big proponent of that. When you are like writing up your methods section for an academic paper, you should say not only what software you're using, but also what version, you know, so that people can reproduce it.
In your day-to-day, this is one of my questions because I love when this happens. Do you ever have a project come to you where somebody says, no, I want to use this specific proprietary software, and you said, but we could do it in QGIS, and eventually you say, okay, we do it in QGIS. Do you ever have that sort of like see the light moment where somebody says, oh, we can do it that way?
Yeah, mostly the folks I'm working with are coming to me because they need a geospatial person on their project, and they don't necessarily have the skill set up. So they usually don't have a preference for which software we're using. My particular corner of the library, DataLab, has made a policy that we work with open source whenever possible. So we don't work with proprietary software unless it's 100% necessary. So that doesn't happen very often. I do get people coming to office hours who, you know, are like, oh, I'm trying to do this in, you know, whatever software they're trying to do it in. And if it's not working, oftentimes we'll be like, hey, you know, you can do this. I know it will work with, you know, this, whatever tool is, you know, another option. And sometimes folks will shift over and be like, well, you know, it doesn't matter to me what it is, as long as it works and gets me to the next step, which I think is honestly the mindset to have. I'm really a big fan of, you know, use what works. And so sometimes that does mean shifting between different softwares.
Yeah, and that comes back to your comment about education, which I really resonated quite a bit with me, is that, you know, really focus on method and theory, and software really comes second, right? So if you're really knowing what you're doing, or learning how to do a certain type of analysis, coming at it with whatever software is fine, right? Just do it. Ooh, big question that came in.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of QGIS. I work in India mainly. Actually, I'll read through this as I ask you the next question.
Yeah, I'm seeing something about languages, which I didn't mention in the collaboration. Yeah, so there, I'm just like skimming it really quick. They mentioned that you know, I should probably read this more carefully, but we will do that in a second. But one of the things I didn't mention when I mentioned collaboration is that QGIS is translated into, I think, like 30 something languages. Don't quote me on the number, but it's a very large number, and it's translatable into whatever language you have skills in. So when you're working with folks who, you know, like to think in another language, they can actually use a translation, and that will help people who, you know, don't necessarily want to work in English. So that is a huge help when you're working internationally. Like, you know, for me, working with folks outside of the US, if they need a GIS and they need it to be in their own language, that is entirely possible for that to happen. So yay, QGIS people. And then we'll at some point take a look at this question in more depth and make sure we answer it correctly.
I think you did. Like, basically, do you face an anomaly in data if compiling data sets from different regions? I guess for different regions, meaning if there's different languages being spoken in these different regions. But I guess you're pretty much working in the US, right? So you're not facing those issues.
Yeah, so The data I'm working with for the AVA project is all for the US. However, on a slightly different like interpretation of translating, the folks who write the boundary definitions for this particular legal definition, a lot of times these are people who are vintners. They make wine. Their skill is in winemaking and growing grapes and things like that. They are often not skilled at maps. So a lot of times we will get really strange descriptions, and sometimes they get like east and west, north and south mixed up. Less north and south, but east and west, it is not uncommon to find a boundary where they have clearly used the wrong cardinal direction. So we do have to do some interpretation sometimes, because we're like, you could not have meant to go, west. You must have meant go east, because otherwise the boundary won't connect back to itself the way it's supposed to. So, so there is that sort of translation to like technical terminology.
That actually follows my next, relates to my next question, is that in your digitizing of these boundaries, how do you handle uncertainty? So if the digitizer is going to say, you know what, I'm making that decision, west is actually east, is that noted somewhere?
Yes, we keep track of that in the GitHub issue for that particular AVA boundary. So if you look at, like, I think if I'll put the link to the project in the chat so you can go dig around. Make sure this goes to everybody. I think if you look at like Mount Washington, that's one that came up recently. There's a big discussion about like one of the maps that is digitized doesn't line up with the other ones. What do we do about that? Or there are definitely some where we're like, okay, we're going to make the call that they meant go east instead of west. And so we'll actually write that in the GitHub issue, so that's recorded. And then when we have to make map substitutions, so for example, we can't find the map that they say is the official map to use in the description, we have a column in our attribute table where we note what maps we actually use to digitize that boundary, so that people know that, we had to vary and there was a good reason for it, but that map wasn't available for some reason, or we couldn't find it.
Right. Awesome. We have another question that just came in just about digitizing aerial photos. I think this relates mostly to tie points. So when you're digitizing historic images, what information do you have? What basic information do you have? Do you have to use like street intersections? Do you typically have lat long lines on the map, boundaries, I guess you would say?
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky. Like with the air photos, a lot of our air photos are for less urban areas and more like rural. We have a lot of photos of like riverine type environments. So, a riparian area with big fluffy trees, if that's all that's in the picture, sometimes it's really hard to figure out where that goes. And so like, sometimes the people digitizing for that project will actually lay them out like the picture you saw, and kind of estimate, like, we're not trying to get perfect with those, but yeah, sometimes you have to get a little creative when you have when you're referencing to things like road networks and stuff like that. But we also have a lot of options for different like base map type things, like different satellite imagery sets that we can use, and different time points that can be helpful with some of those.
That's great. Another question about AVAs. Tell me a little bit about the AVAs on top of AVAs. How does that work? Is it like a sub-region within a region?
They are, honestly, they don't communicate with each other that closely. I didn't pull up my QGIS project, but QGIS and Zoom don't do real well together, so it's probably for the best. They both use a graphics card, so it makes things really slow. But they are, the idea with the AVA boundaries is that people are defining an area that they feel makes a particular characteristic of wine, so they don't often line up very well. Occasionally they will share a boundary, and we have a process for deciding how we match up boundaries where we're sure that they should be matched up. But they're not like, no one has really taken like California and divided it into specific areas and said like, this is California and then this is this region, that's that region. There's a lot of overlap, and a lot of overlap in ways that is like they made the AVA without considering the other AVAs in the area, which I think is actually probably the better way to go given the directive for what an AVA is supposed to be. It really probably shouldn't take into account anything else besides the area that produces a specific quality of wine. So
Right.
yeah.
Next question. How are the different versions of AVA stored in GitHub? In separate files with version numbers or in some way? So how does that work if you're going to update versions of a boundary?
Yeah, so we have done, so the way that GitHub works is each file kind of has its own version history. So they are like, if you take the whole data set together, each file sort of has its own revision history and its own timestamp on it. We have done releases. We've done 2 releases that are sort of like a collection where, you know, we're like, we got to a certain, what do you call it, like milestone. Like when we finished California, we did a release of just California. And then we did another one, I think, when we finished all of the AVAs and the revision history for a certain time period. And we're getting to the point where we should do another one because we just finished I think the last set of AVAs that was published recently. So we do have releases where you can say like, this is a time point. But otherwise, GitHub just kind of does its thing, and there's you know, different versions, different time points. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about the narrative text. That the boundaries were originally just narrative text, and somebody asked, why weren't they a spatial data set back then? I guess I'm thinking back then, I'm thinking this is an old data set, right? Because
Yes,
I've seen that a lot with survey boundaries where a property is defined in narrative text.
Yes. So the answer to that, I think, lies quite a bit in the fact that AVAs, the whole AVA process was started, I believe, in 1980, might have been in the late 70s. So while these are defined, like the boundaries themselves are defined using specific topo maps, they were never like, I don't think there was the capability to create this kind of data set back then. And there certainly wasn't a place to store it. So there's that. I'll put a link in the chat to the official boundary for Rocky Reach that we just finished. I need to do actually the pull request for this one, but you can kind of get an idea. Like this one, for example, says the beginning point is on a particular map at the intersection of the 1,200-foot elevation contour on the western boundary of section 15, blah, blah, blah. So like you can kind of get an idea of what these narratives look like. And yeah, I think there just wasn't really a way to do this, you know, consistently back when this started. And so they've kept the same process. A few years ago, the TTB actually started producing their own data set, like a few years after we started ours. But I haven't seen on the most recent website for theirs, I haven't found their methods. At one point they did have, I knew something about the way that they were producing theirs, but it's not as specific as the way ours are produced. So they are a little quicker than us, but we have a very specific method that we use that's very well defined.
I guess that then comes into like who's actually participating in this, and is the TTB aware of what you're doing? Has there been any contact between your project and them?
It's been so long. I feel like at one point we did try to make contact. There hasn't been a lot of discussion between the two groups. And when their data set came online, I was surprised because we hadn't heard about it. But also I feel like we did email back and forth at one point. The trick though is like with theirs, I don't think they're necessarily following the exact boundary definitions as closely as we are. They can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but when the map originally, when their data set originally came out, I was under the impression that we were being a lot more meticulous about using only the maps instead of other data sources. So if, you know, you're supposed to follow a river and you can clip out a river boundary and use that, that's a lot quicker, but it's not necessarily what the original text says to do. And, you know, sometimes the topo map lines are not the same as like if you get like, you know, the NHD data, for example. So we're only using the maps whenever we can, and we're very explicit about our methods.
Interesting. So with that said, When do you think this will be done? And if you were to guess, what percentage of AVAs do you think you have mapped now?
We are, if I approve the Rocky Reach pull request, I believe we are done with the current set of new AVAs that just came online in the last few months. And we are going to be transitioning to, we're in the process of figuring out what, what boundaries have been revised since the last time we worked on the revisions to add in those changes. And then also we still have some quality control to do. Unfortunately, this project will never be done as long as they're approving new AVAs. So
Right.
it goes in waves, but so yeah, like right now, hopefully actually this afternoon, I'll get a chance to look at the Rocky Reach one, but we should be current on the boundaries in terms of the current boundaries, but yeah, we still got some work to do on some of the other things that have come up, you know, in the last, like over the summer. So
Have you ever looked outside, like maybe in the planning of this project or maybe throughout this project, looked at how other countries might manage their wine regions, to sort of compare notes to that?
yeah, I haven't been able to find data sets. Like at one point we were looking into like what other countries had, and in particular, like looking at Mexico and Canada. But I haven't seen a data set for those. It might exist and I just, you know, wasn't able to find it. And I think that, you know, it's been so long since we started this project. I don't exactly remember what all we looked at.
Right.
But a lot of these, like the AVAs in particular, but I think other boundaries too, are often the data is held in, you know, by a private company. So, you know, the data might exist, but it might cost money or you just don't have access, and it might not be complete, which is, you know, what we ran into in the US. So that's why we did our project, because it just didn't exist for the US.
Well, I'll end with this last question from somebody listening so what's the long-term plan for the data set? I guess maintaining it, but is there some sort of plan there for it?
Yeah, so I actually this summer I got contacted by one of our original project collaborators, who's our geography librarian, who was like, hey, we need to put this in Earthworks. So we're going to be working on getting the data set to a point where we're ready to do a specific release, and then making that available in you know, a widely accessible repository that everyone has access to. But you can also always get it on GitHub. The data there is available, and I would recommend downloading one of our aggregated files, like the avas.geojson file has all the current AVAs, for example. So you don't have to download individual ones. Unless you want individual ones, you can get those. But if you want the whole set, I would highly recommend just grabbing one of the aggregated files, because that'll make your life a lot easier.
Amazing. Well, Michele, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for answering all the questions, and thanks for everybody who showed up and asked
Yeah,
all these questions. It's been great, and good luck with all your work.
thanks. I'm
All right.
happy to have been here, and I'm glad to see all these folks in the attendees list.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye now.